So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, or to all people connected. Also, I would thank the beginning of this webinar, the ADISO organization, for this webinar, and also for the short educative videos that were published or presented 2 or 3 months ago. So if you haven't seen these videos yet, I encourage you to look at them. So anyway, I think as indicated by Pierre, this webinar is mainly composed of question and answer. So don't hesitate for that. But just before starting, I would give a few slides in order to summarize what was given and the key points about net energy in poultry and in pigs. So as you can see on that first slide, I think when we talk about energy utilization, we start from gross energy, and then we move to DE and to ME, and then to net energy. I will not detail all these steps, but I will focus mainly today on, I think the question will answer all these points, about the last part of this diagram, talking about K, which is the ratio between net energy and ME, about heat increment, and about the calculation and the measurement of net energy, which is the addition of energy gain plus fasting reproduction. So next slide, how do we measure energy gain? I think there are different techniques or different methods for doing that. I think comparative slaughter methods and so on and so on. But I think nowadays, I think most techniques are based on the calorimetry and more precisely the indirect calorimetry method. So what do we do for calculating energy gain in the indirect calorimetry method? We obtain energy gain as the difference between ME intake by the animals minus their heat production. But for measuring this ME intake and this heat production, there are some points to be careful. First, we are talking about diets, and so the animal should be adapted to the diet. I have put 5 to 10 days, and I think that's a minimum to adapt an animal to a new diet. So for using the indirect calorimetry method, we use so-called respiration chambers, which is a closed room, and I think it's important to adapt the animal to this new environment, and that should be at least for 1 day. Further, afterwards, you have to measure the heat production per se, and I think you need at least 2 or 3 days, or even 5 days, and that should be done under very standardized and representative conditions. And that's very important for interpreting the data afterwards. So be careful, for instance, if you see net energy measurements conducted over only 1 day, even less than 1 day, I think you should be very careful in the interpretation of the data. So at the same time, you measure the animal in the restaurant chambers, you can measure the ME intake. And at the end, net energy is calculated as energy gain plus fasting reproduction. So in the short videos, fasting reproduction was fully detailed and described how to obtain these values. So what I want to insist at that stage is that measuring net energy is rather complex. I think you need equipment, you need to calibrate, you need very routine methods, and that's not easy. That's time consuming, that's a long-term response. I mean, you don't get the response only 1 day. You need weeks and even months for measurements, and that's expensive, and so on and so on. So I consider that measuring net energy is more a research activity. So next slide, I will insist on another point which is important, and I will talk about that today, I think, during the questions. That's what do we listen or what do we understand by net energy system? I think a net energy system is equivalent to one net energy equation. Clearly, net energy, in practical terms, is not measured. It is calculated from an equation. These equations can be obtained according to different methods, but usually these equations come from the combination of net energy measurements that are conducted on very well-balanced and variable diets under very controlled, standardized, and representative conditions. So the videos explain that a little bit. So which type of models are we using for calculating these equations? Usually we use linear regression models where net energy is calculated as a function of the amount of digestible nutrients in the feed, or it is a function of the DE or DME content plus some correction factors, or it can even be net energy as a function of some indirect measurements such as in vitro or infrared indicators. So clearly net energy, and we talk about that today, is calculated from an equation. Next slide. So what's the situation for the two groups of animals we have to deal with today? I think for pigs, the net energy prediction equations, they are available, they are validated, or they have been validated, they are quite robust, and as a consequence, they are today, I think, widely used in feeding tables and in the feed industries all over the world. For poultry, the situation is a bit different. I think there are some equations available, but these equations have not been fully validated. And one consequence of that, but there are also other reasons, is that net energy is not much yet used in practice. So that means that in order to be more convincing about using net energy in poultry, we should do some additional research. Next slide for illustrating what's the difference between pigs and broilers. So on that table, I have put some typical ingredients, or soy oil, corn, wheat, and soybean meal. You know about the chemical composition of these ingredients, which are totally different. What you can see first is that the ratio between net energy and ME is different according to this the chemical composition of the ingredients. For oil or for full fat sources, I mean, the efficiency is quite high, 90%. For the cereals, it's somewhere in the middle, 80%. And for soybean meal, it is much lower, about 60%. But I show that slide mainly to illustrate or to focus on the comparison between pigs and broilers. I mean, these values were calculated from two sets of equations, one published by INRA for pigs and one published by the University of New England in Australia for broilers. You can see that pigs and broilers are behaving very similarly in terms of efficiency of ME for net energy. So nowadays we are using net energy very routinely for pigs. So why shouldn't we use also net energy for broilers in the future according to such data? So the last slides for this introduction will show what should be done in practice for the feed industry organization. So as I said before, net energy value of diets and of ingredients is calculated from an equation or a system. So the important point there is to decide on one equation or one system, and preferably one system that has been validated on diets and on ingredients. So I think I will stress also on one point, which is very important, is that some research organizations, some groups in the world are measuring DE, net energy value of ingredients. In my opinion, I think there is no need to measure net energy of ingredients. But in the case of ingredients, what is important is to get DE or ME values or digestible nutrients, which are quite reliable, which have been updated and so on, in order to calculate or to include these values afterwards in the net energy equation. Last point before moving to the question is that net energy values from different origins, I mean different equations, different labs and so on, cannot be combined. You should be very careful about that. And so again, you need to decide on one system or one equation in order to calculate and to implement net energy in your company. So that's all for the introduction. That's a summary of the short videos we presented 2 or 3 months ago. And so now I think we can move to questions, and we try with Pierre and Pierre-André to answer all of them or most of them.